that you get your seats, and we will begin in just 10 seconds. This is a real experiment. You know, for 5 semesters we've been running the open classroom, and we've been looking at things like the 21st century city. We've been looking at economic growth and social justice. We looked in the fall of 2008 during the historic election at policy advice to the next president. And of course, so far this semester, because I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, we've been looking at globalization, particularly in terms of the international economy and economic development, growth, and then global security, looking at the Middle East, looking at Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. But when Professor Dickens and I decided to put this together, we thought globalization is much broader than that. Globalization is about all of those things, but it's also about culture. And so, for those of you who are here for the first time, and to remind those who are here for the nth time, this is going to be the first of 4 of our open classrooms that's devoted to the whole question of global culture. And this one I'm particularly excited about. I also want to remind you that we're also going to be adding a special class of the open classroom 1 week after our last regular one, April 28th, same place, 6 o'clock. And we have a number of journalists who have been working in Haiti since the earthquake who will be joining us to talk about what's been going on there from the ground view. But tonight, and I've been looking forward all semester to this evening, because not only do we have 2 absolutely spectacular people here, but they also happen to be close friends of mine. And I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly, because we started a little late, and I want to get into the program because this should be very, very special. One of the things that we thought at the very beginning when Bill and I were talking about this is we wanted to do something on music, partly because we both like music. But then we decided to narrow it in a little bit and look at something that was quintessentially American and went global, and now has come back in all kinds of new, wonderful ways. And so we decided to focus not on all music, but on global jazz. And tonight we have 2 absolutely marvelous people to introduce this subject to us. Bob Blumenthal, some of you know him because of his long column that he had in the Boston Globe as a major jazz critic, someone who has written a marvelous book, and we have copies here that you might want to during the break or right after. Jazz, an introduction to the history and legends behind America's music. I read this book. This is a spectacular book for those who know jazz well and for those who don't know it at all. Bob's won Grammys for his notes on jazz, but you're in for a spectacular pleasure. I also have invited my dear friend Ted Kurland, who's the founder of Ted Kurland Associates. He started playing around with advancing musicians while he was a student at Brandeis in the 1920s, and has turned it into an incredible business. Right. 30 years before Brandeis was even founded. It shows you how advanced Ted was in thinking about musicians. And he has, over the years, represented some of the truly jazz greats of the 20th and now 21st century. And he'll tell you about that. He's just returned from Europe, and is going to tell us a little bit about the music industry and how it's changed from his days at Brandeis to the days of the global music scene. So without further ado, Bob Blumenthal.
Thank you, Barry. Always an experiment when you put me next to a machine, so bear with me if things don't work. It was a great example. Trying to get some music. Let's try again.
Did you mute it?
Oh, I muted it.
Oh, you muted it. Okay, well, that might okay. I want to thank Barry and everyone here for inviting me, and thank you all for attending. I always find it a real real pleasure to get to play music for people. And I should warn you before I start, I hope this doesn't bother anyone, because one of my pet peeves is visual aids when we're talking about music. And I always tell people, I'll tell you what we're listening to. You must take notes, but just listen and close your eyes and listen to the music. I have to apologize because I'm breaking two of my rules. One is talking over the music, but we have a limited amount of time. And the other is interrupting performances and not listening to entire performances. But I hope you'll understand. I hope you'll bear with me. It was a fascinating time that I spent preparing to talk about global culture and jazz. It makes a lot of sense to use jazz as an example of global culture. However, in my book, which Barry was nice enough to mention, which Brookline Booksmith has been nice enough to bring copies for sale here, in the jazz book, I talk about jazz as the first world music, and the method of jazz creation as the musical Esperanto of the 20th century. And elsewhere in the introduction to the book, I mentioned that in much of the world, jazz has come to symbolize America, and in societies ruled by forces of oppression, it has been embraced as the sound image of freedom. Now, big claims, but all justified, I feel, by the music's history, which to me is a fascinating subject in and of itself, whether we look at it globally or not. What we're listening to at the moment is a recording that won the Village Voice poll of 120 music critics as the best jazz album of 2009. This is the title track from an album called Historicity. And the artist is a pianist named Vijay Iyer. Vijay is a first-generation American. Well, I believe I always get this wrong. His parents are from India. They moved to the U.S. He was born in the U.S. His music has had substantial content drawing upon his Indian background as well as drawing upon jazz to create his own unique perspective on music that isn't Indian music, is jazz, but is jazz that's been influenced by world influences, if you will. Now, one way I thought I could start today was do a Lou Dobbs impression and rant and rail about how our music's being stolen by these foreign influences. How dare the critics of the Village Voice give an award to an Indian American piano player. But I come in a far second to Stephen Colbert, so I don't think I can pull that off. But I do think it's one example of where we've gotten to, and I'm hoping in my remarks to get us to that point. So if you will, here's a brief history of global jazz. Some of these will have to be made a little louder. What we're listening to now is a recording from 1919. You probably recognize the song as St. Louis Blues. It's being played by an orchestra of African Americans who were serving in the European theater in the First World War and actually toured as a band to lift the spirits of the troops in a way you're probably more familiar with Glenn Miller leading a band in the European theater in World War II, Artie Shaw leading a band in the Pacific theater. This was James Reese Europe. Curiously enough, his last name was Europe, and he made his biggest impact in Europe. He led a band called Lieutenant Jim Europe's 369th Infantry Hellfighters Band. And this was the first jazz-like music, we might say, that was heard in Europe during the war. The recording was made after the war in 1919, when Europe returned to the States. brought his band into a studio in New York and recorded several titles. There's debate among historians about whether Europe was playing jazz or just a precursor to jazz, but there's definitely the syncopation in this performance. There's definitely the blues structure. They're the foundation points of jazz. So that jazz was already making its way in the world at a point when many people in this country were still getting to know it, or really maybe not even having heard it for the first time. In fact, it made such an impression that after the war, African-American musical artists continued to tour in Europe, which is not something that started with the war. Of course, the gospel groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers had made tours in the 19th century. But after Europe's band had come back, other orchestras toured Europe as well. And in fact, shortly after this recording was made, the first serious piece of jazz criticism was published in Belgium. It was written by a gentleman named Ernst Ansermet, who was a very prominent conductor. He had actually conducted the premiere performance of The Rite of Spring. And he heard a band called the Southern Syncopators, which featured a young soprano saxophonist named Sidney Bechet. And it was Will Marion Cook's Southern Syncopated Orchestra. And in 1919, Ansermet proclaimed Bechet to be the first of his race to have composed perfectly formed blues on the clarinet. And then Ansermet predicted that Bechet's approach was the highway the whole world will swing along tomorrow. Pretty prescient for 1919, if you will. We've now jumped up to 1934 and listening to a recording made in Paris by Louis Armstrong called The Song of the Vipers. Now, there are a variety of reasons why musicians went overseas. Some because there were work opportunities they could not find here. I don't know if you want the music lower or me lower.
Music a little lower.
For me, and in fact, there were musicians, prominent musicians, going to Asia, going to South America, going to Europe. Buck Clayton, the great trumpet player, played with Count Basie later in the 30s, worked in the Far East. Armstrong went to Europe because he had run afoul of some nightclub owners in Chicago of rather unsavory character. And his new manager felt it was best to get him out of the country. But what's interesting about this record, among many things, including Armstrong's great performance, is that this is legitimate jazz that's being performed by a great American artist surrounded by European musicians in 1934. How did they come to be as comfortable as they are with jazz? Well, of course, technology had spread the word well before Armstrong had arrived, or Duke Ellington had arrived in 1932. The recordings that these great artists were making in the 1920s were crossing the ocean, were being listened to and studied by musicians. And this is not to say that Armstrong found a band as talented as one he might have been able to assemble in Chicago or New York, but he did find a band with which he could communicate in a common language. And so he was able to spend his downtime in Europe quite comfortably touring, performing with native musicians in France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany. Well, not Germany at that point, I take that back. And then he returned to the U.S. in 1935. But he was the harbinger of what was a constant stream of musicians who were leaving this country, primarily African-American musicians who simply couldn't find the opportunities in the U.S. that they could find overseas. So as this track ends, which is going to be momentarily, maybe I should jump ahead. Okay. Some of the greatest in the late 1930s became so frustrated that they went to Europe because they could exist as featured musicians and make much more money than they could in this country. And those who were composers and orchestrators could find work that just was not available what we're listening to now is a 1937 recording of Crazy Rhythm. The band is called Coleman Hawkins All-Star Jam Band. And it features two immortal American musicians, Coleman Hawkins on tenor sax, Benny Carter on alto sax, who also wrote the arrangement of the piece. They are paired in this jam band with two counterparts from France. One, André Etienne, who's like Carter playing the alto sax. The other, Alix Combel, who, like Hawkins, is playing the tenor sax. And the rhythm section also includes the first great non-American jazz musician, Django Reinhardt, playing the guitar, and a gentleman that you might be more familiar with as a violinist, Stefan Grappelli, who's playing the piano for this band. Now, Hawkins and Carter had both been extremely prominent in New York and had been featured with Fletcher Henderson, among others. But they saw how limited their opportunities were in the States during an era when segregation was still clearly in what was the order of the day. And they found many greater opportunities in Europe. It wasn't until swing music became popular later in the 1930s that they felt it was worth their while to come back to the States, suffer the indignities of racism for what was suddenly a better economic opportunity for them in terms of their performances. But again, while they were out of the country, they were able to sustain themselves artistically because they found a growing number of musicians who could speak their language. In this case, not just a backup band, as Armstrong had, but prominent soloists and prominent musicians in their own right. Now, we've talked about Americans going to other countries, but let's also point out, if we can, this is a piece that may be familiar to some of you, but I also want to point out that other musicians were coming to this country and having an impact on American artists. What we're listening to is a 1947 recording by Dizzy Gillespie's orchestra, Manteca, one of their most famous performances. And it's credited jointly to Gillespie, the arranger Gil Fuller, and the percussionist Chano Pozo, who was a Cuban who came to Harlem shortly after World War II, and who really introduced the concept of Latin jazz, or Afro-Cuban jazz, into popular culture through his meeting with Gillespie and the collaborations in pieces such as this. So now you had a clear example of a global influence on American music. And all of the Latin jazz that we've become familiar with over time, Tito Puente and Palmieri, on and on and on, really stems from these kind of meetings that were taking place. Chano Pozo wasn't the first important musician to come to the States and exert an influence from Cuba. A multi-instrumentalist and composer named Mario Bauza had played with Gillespie and Cab Calloway's band and went on to assist his brother-in-law Machito in forming the first great Afro-Latin band in the States. Pozo, though, was the first prominent soloist. Now, not only were techniques from other countries being introduced, but music of other cultures as well. I thought of playing a jazzed version of a classical piece. Some of you have probably heard various tracks of that type, but I thought I'd try something else as an example. Now, if I ask people in the room what the name of the song is, I bet most could name it, but I'm not sure they would give it the name that it has on this recording by Sonny Rollins. This is Mac the Knife, of course, but Rollins, when he recorded it in 1956, used the original title Moratine, because this was part of the score of the Three Penny Opera, which Kurt Blumenthal, directed, written in 1929, and it had been revived in New York in German in 1952. And Lotte Lenya had recorded Kurt Weill's music shortly thereafter. And this is where Rollins was introduced to the piece. Around the same time, Louis Armstrong had made a pop record of Mac Tonight. But this is a global influence of jazz in another way, finding material from other cultures that can be interpreted in a jazz manner, which, examples abound. Let me just say that this is one. And let me also make my second shameless plug of the evening and mention that, that my next book, which is called Saxophone Colossus, A Portrait of Sonny Rollins, is being published on September 7th, which is Sonny Rollins' 80th birthday. And there's a chapter called More Time. Felt it would only be proper to listen to a little tonight. Now, other artists in other cultures were also finding ways to use jazz. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting ahead of myself. At the time Rollins made his recording, it was the height of the Cold War. And there wasn't a free cultural exchange between East and West. Yet jazz was heard very prominently in Iron Curtain countries. And in fact, quite possibly the most famous American in the 1950s and 60s behind the Iron Curtain was a gentleman named Willis Conover. Have any of you ever heard of Willis Conover? Willis Conover did a radio program on the Voice of America that played jazz. And this was the access that people in the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain countries, had to jazz music. It was broadcast all over the world. But it became a very powerful cultural force. And it led to the government beginning to sponsor cultural tours by jazz artists. So we're listening to Dizzy Gillespie again, this time recorded in 1956, playing Cool Breeze, is the name of the song, playing it in an unidentified South American country. During 1956, the State Department asked Gillespie to reorganize his big band and do a goodwill tour of South America. And the people who toured with him made tapes along the way, so they're not sure if this is Sao Paulo or Santiago or Buenos Aires, but suddenly the musicians were becoming ambassadors. And in fact, a few years after this recording, Dave Brubeck wrote what he had hoped to be a Broadway show called The Real Ambassadors, which was about musicians acting as cultural representatives of the United States, and which included Louis Armstrong and Lambert Hendricks and Ross and Carmen McRae. Many, if not all of whom had participated in State Department tours. Brubeck had been one of the prominent band leaders who led his group to Europe in the 1950s, ultimately led all over the world. Gillespie was so successful in South America in 1956 that he was sent back to Europe and the Middle East in 1957. Duke Ellington did many of these tours, and they generated some of his great later music, like the Far East Suite, the Latin American Suite, and other music that he wrote in the last decade of his life. So now we've got jazz globally as a political force, or as a political representation of the United States. But as I said a little prematurely a minute ago, other artists and other cultures were finding ways to use jazz. This is, I believe, the title music from Louis Malle's first film. And I won't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce the French title. In English, it was called Elevator to the Scaffold. And what Malle did was, when Miles Davis was in Europe in 1957, he brought him into a recording studio, and they ran the film, and Miles and a group of musicians improvised the soundtrack. So this is one of the first jazz soundtracks. Another interesting thing about this performance from 1957 It's another example of how jazz serves as an international language. There are 5 musicians performing. 3 of them are European, 2 of them are American. Of the 2 Americans, 1 was an expatriate who had moved to France, the drummer Penny Clark. The other 3, Barney Guilan, the saxophonist, René Outreger, the pianist, and Pierre Michelot, the bassist, were European, born, raised, bound